Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Vicki Jeter, and I am the minister for Louisville Center for Spiritual Living Teaching Chapter. And if you're with us here on the Zoom today or listening on the recording, we welcome you on this 14th day of July, 2024, opening our What's the Law Got to Do with It workshop with Reverend Dr. Anthony Suarez, Esquire. And so just very briefly, I will introduce Dr. Tony. We graduated from ministerial school together. That's where I met Tony. And gradually, throughout the process of ministerial school and coming to being licensed as ministers together, I came to realize the wealth of knowledge and experience that Tony has and the gift that he has to give the world, blending spirituality and the science of mind teaching with actual legal law and the various things that I knew I could really stand to understand better about how our legal system works. And along the way, I learned that Tony's writing this book. And I do actually have a paperback copy of the book today. This is What's the Law Got to Do with It? Paperback copy. It's a fabulous book that in the back of it, he has the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, all in one nice, clean place to be referred to as a foundation, as a resource. And so I just want to say welcome, Dr. Tony, and thank you so much for taking your time to spend with Louisville Center today, and then by extension, offering this to the world. He's on mute. Okay, Tony, you're not unmuted. We need to get you to unmute.
Start again. Okay.
Okay, start again.
Okay. First, thanks. Thanks, Reverend Ricky. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak, and to your board and your members for participating in this, because this book is a little bit difficult. I'll get into it in a minute, because it's a difficult issue. And people, unfortunately, just live their lives and don't understand why things happen. They just let things happen to them, and it's a concern. It's a concern for our citizenship, for our nation. And so I decided that I had to do something. I've been a lawyer for 47 years. I was just explaining to George. I was a soldier. I was, I'll go into this in a couple of minutes. But I have been being very much distressed by what I'm seeing is going on in the nation for the respect for our country. That means for the legislators, for the courts, and that's what leads to people revolts. That's what leads to civil wars, when people just don't understand why things are happening, and then they decide that the only way they can is taking force. And so we've had examples in our own nation. We had a civil war, and there was the blood. 600,000 Americans died. It was immense, and of course across the world, when a group feels that the government is not working properly, they have the tendency to have coup. In Latin America, the coup d'états all over the place, and of course the word itself, coup d'état, is French because they invented it, right? So it's difficult to have faith in the system if you don't understand it. So with my experience as a lawyer, as a politician, etc., I thought that I would do a ministry on understanding. So this is what this book is about, is an attempt to try to explain at least that portion of the First Amendment, that portion of the Constitution that deals with religious rights, as a minister, as a lawyer, a law professor, how I can explain to people so they can have some form of understanding. Okay, that's why they did this, and not just throw their hands up and say, okay, they must be politicians, and therefore the only way to change it perhaps is someone who's who's advocating, advocating violence, perhaps. So that's why I wrote this book. It's about that. It's about trying to give people some faith again about our system, both the political system and the our judicial system, because without that, I'm very concerned that we would not have anything. So let's go to the next slide. All right. So what I'm trying to do is make the book between a crossroads between law and philosophy. Crossroads between law and how people think. Philosophy being the thinking, right? Why things happen a certain way, and then we have the law. How does the law happen? How does a law become an idea? How the idea becomes a law, and then how it's implemented. All of this is really a complex system, which in a law school actually takes several courses. And then I taught in law school. I taught the legislative process, and I taught election law, and both are forms of constitutional law. And so I do that. So that's what this is. And you'll see me, this picture here of me before the Florida state legislature, because I was a legislator at one time in Florida, and I was invited. I was able to open up the legislature with an opening prayer so that the whole state can see that we exist here. There's a movement called Science of Mind, and that was a great opportunity for me. Next slide. All right, so just to know from who's speaking to you, and from which basis from which. Of course, I've got my law degree. I've been a community leader. I've been a law professor. You see me there walking during the parade where I was the grand marshal of the parade. Behind me is Senator. That was at that time the senator from Florida, and speaking engagements. I have a wealth of experience as a legislator, as a professor of law, and of course now as a minister of faith. And so this is from which. Next slide. So with that, knowing that I have the experience, and I expressed to you why I'm doing this book, let's talk about what it is that I'm talking about. What is this? Again, we can talk about in a breakout session afterwards. We could talk about anything you'd like. You can bring all sorts of stuff. But the book is meant to try to combine this crossroads, I said, between the law on faith, on issues that deal with faith, and in the law, in the philosophy of how the judges make decisions. Because if you don't understand how the judges get the decision, you're going to say it's all fixed. It's a fix, as opposed to understanding, well, I may not agree with the decision, but I see how they got there. All right, this is what we're trying to accomplish. So what is the background of the First Amendment? All right, well, we have to look back at what before the Constitution, before the Constitution was written, what we had. Well, before that, when we had our Civil War, Revolutionary War, we'll call it the Revolutionary War against Britain, we're operating with something called the Articles of Confederation. There was no president, there was no Senate. It was just a parliament, basically, and every state sent delegates, but we did not have a constitution. When they finally decided that that was too weak of an instrument in which to run our country, because the British and the French were hijacking our soldiers, we couldn't protect our shores, everything was going around. They needed to have a stronger federal government, a stronger national government, in order to be able to defend itself against everybody else. Remember, and the British were still on the continent in Canada, the Spanish were in the south, the French were in the middle of Mississippi, and so then we were surrounded by enemies, and we could not control ourselves. We didn't even have an army. So they decided, let's get together and draft a way of doing business, a way of running this government, and so we created this Constitution. We're going to discuss some of it in basic form. So I apologize to you, George. As a lawyer, you're going to have to go through this preliminary, but I'm going to take it through for everybody, so make sure we don't lose everybody. So we're going to have this. We're going to have this new government, and they understood that among the most important rights was the right to free association, and that is a freedom of faith. You have your own faith. They knew from what they came from in Europe, right? In Europe, they had wars where the Catholics were against the Protestants and the Christians versus the Muslims. They had all different cultures, interpretations, different gods, and different ways. And as a result of all the religious diversity, you had many wars, and you had much oppression of people and women and slaves and all sorts of things that they did not want to have in this new world, in this new idea, this new concept, what is the United States of America. And they realized that in order to protect that, you had to have people free, and government should not be involved in determining what is or is not a proper faith. So at that point, so many of the states actually had official religions. They have ministers that were on the state payroll. So they created this, the First Amendment, and first of freedom of speech. Everybody knows that freedom of speech, the First Amendment, but it also talks about this establishment. And these two clauses is what we're going to be talking about in this book and in this chat. And that is that Congress shall make no law regarding an establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Those little words, those two clauses, Congress shall make no law regarding establishment of religion, one clause, and the other one clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Those two clauses actually clash and cause what we call a tension in the amendment, and as a result of that's what the courts are going to try to balance out when we get cases. So the best case you could example is in the early part of our nation, we had laws prohibiting people opening business on Sundays. Why? Why was it? It's because Sundays was the day of the Sabbath. If the day of the Sabbath, they decided we're not going to allow you to open your business the day you must rest. Because in the commandments, the Lord said, you rest on the seventh day. The seventh day for them, those who wrote the law, said would be Sunday. Except for the fact that there are people who saw the Sabbath on Saturday. Okay? And so if you're going to have a law prohibiting opening your business on Sunday, you are now prohibiting the free exercise of my religion if I perceive Saturday to be the Sabbath day. So that's an example, and that's why those laws, those blue laws, as they call them, were overturned by the Supreme Court much earlier in our tradition. So what we're trying to do is examine that tension. And I'm going to give some specific cases in a couple of minutes. We're going specific cases. And what I'm hoping that you understand is you see the tension, and then you can see, what are the issues before the Supreme Court at the moment? Whether or not it's whether the president has immunity, or whether this woman has a right to privacy, or whether or not you can support with public funding private religious schools. All those types of issues fall into this tension that Congress can neither establish a religion nor can they prohibit the free exercise thereof. So all those issues that you read about in the newspaper on a constant basis comes from that tension in that clause. So today, our whole system is under scrutiny. Almost everything is in the newspaper. We don't know whether the judges are being honest or not being honest, or they're being bribed or not being bribed, or they're politicians or they're theoreticians. All of it is really being up and down. In fact, something as simple as had been determined some time ago is coming back up again. Louisiana just recently voted a law requiring the posting of the Ten Commandments on all public schools. Now, there's already a decision that said, in the Supreme Court decision, that the posting of the Ten Commandments in a public place would be establishment of a religion. So why would Louisiana, I'm just talking, this is news that came out just not even a month. Why would Louisiana even attempt to put a law in the books that the Supreme Court has previously said would have been an establishment and therefore unconstitutional. And that's because they believe that they now have 6 judges on that bench that may interpret this clause differently that was interpreted before. And so therefore they'll pass the law, the ACLU will sue, we'll get it to the Supreme Court, and then we will look at whether or not the Supreme Court decides that the previous case was a precedent that should be followed or not, that was a wrong precedent, and they'll establish a new case. You could follow that through the courts. Now, having taken this mini course, you will be able to follow that and say, okay, I remember what Professor Suarez said, about this tension in the courts. So I'm trying to establish a basic understanding of how decisions are made, so that it's not a mystery, so we can respect the system. If it remains a mystery to most Americans, then they will lose respect. And that's when all of a sudden the next amendment, the Second Amendment, because everyone's got pistols or rifles, yay, it's very easy to lead us into a civil war as we had in the past. At the end of this book, I have a glossary of terms for you to use, because I figured there's a lot of legal mumbo jumbo, and I'm trying to avoid the legal mumbo jumbo just by talking plain English, but it's inevitable because the courts talk about certain tests and, what is the free exercise clause and what is the lemon law, and there are different terminologies. So rather than leave it up for you, I collected all those terms and I put them in the back of the book as a glossary so that you can look at the glossary and then when you go start reading about the cases, and when you have discussions with your friends about these issues, you'll sound excellent when you've got the right terminology. Like, for example, stare decisis. What is stare decisis? What does it mean? And what is a president? What is a super president? These are terms that we'll discuss during this course, this class, and I've left it in the glossary for you to look. Next slide. All right. So now I put here another tension that we have. The Constitution establishes the responsibility of the federal government to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. Following that, most local governments have passed laws which are classified as public accommodation laws. So, for example, if I give you, you have to apply for a license to be a baker or a plumber or whatever. The government requires licenses for all the stuff, right? So they'll typically say, in order to ensure domestic tranquility, provide common defense and general welfare, we're going to have a standard. In order for you to be a baker or be a plumber, you have to have this requirement, this requirement. Everyone sees that's a good idea. We're just going to have people saying they're a carpenter when they're not really a carpenter, or saying they're a plumber when they're not really a plumber, and they have no qualifications. So the government gets involved in the business of deciding for the public good what is or is not can be a baker, who can be a plumber, and who can be a lawyer or doctor. So now, so that being said, what happens when the public accommodation law that says, in the case we'll discuss about the gay couple, they wanted to get married and they want having a cake, and they go to a baker and they said, baker, I want you to bake a cake for us and put a gay couple on the top. And the baker says, no, I'm not going to do that because it's against my religious beliefs. I don't want to use my talent to support a gay lifestyle when I think that's against my belief. And the counter argument by the gay couple is, wait a minute, they're public accommodations law. You have a license. You must treat everyone equally. How does that clash? How do we resolve the tension between the public accommodations law and individual rights of freedom, self-freedom? Next slide. All right. So here goes. This is basic course. I added this at Vicky's request because she felt that I should go into a little bit of explanation of how our government actually works. All right. So remember that little Schoolhouse Rock where I'm just a little Bill? Well, I actually use that as part of my course at the law school. But an idea is sprung by any legislator. It can be, it could be any person. It gives the idea the legislator writes the bill, whether it's in the Congress or the House of Representatives. So our government is divided into three phases: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. The law is founded in the legislature. And then they are authorized what believe they should be the law of the land. And they give the law to the executive to implement. The executive implements those laws, use of agencies. So we'll pass a law. If you kill somebody, we'll you have a sentence of 50 years, let's say, right? They make the law, but then they give it to the president, who will then execute the law through the Department of Justice. The same thing is whether we want to have clean water in the river. Well, we'll pass the law, we'll give it to the executive, then through the Environmental Protection Agency, they enforce the law through the Environmental Protection Agency. All right? So that's how that part works. They balance each other. They checks and balances between one who writes the law and one who exercises the law. But what happens is all of a sudden they wrote a law that said we can't have dirty water in the river, in Lake Monroe, for example, Lake Monroe, and you are a property owner on the side of Lake Monroe, and you have cows, and your cows are defecating inside in the river. Now the government comes in and says, I'm going to stop you from raising cows because you are violating, you're making the river dirty. Once they stop you, you, the property owner, have the right to challenge that law. And where do you challenge that? In the courts. So then you go to the court, you say they went outside their power, or they're enforcing this law unequally, improperly, and therefore you have the right to balance by going to court to stop the government from executing a law for some violation that you believe violated your rights. So this is how the cycle goes. They pass the law, it is executed by the executive, be the governor or the president, through the agencies, and then it's challenged by whoever the agency is trying to enforce the law against. That is the process, and that's what we'll understand as we go through when all of a sudden someone says, for example, it's okay to give public money to a religious school for the education of students at the religious school. The legislative says that, then the executive has to take money and create a system to be able to get the money to the school, right, for them, get a check out to them. That's how the executive will happen. But then some parent can come down and say, wait a minute, why are you sending public money into a religious school? Aren't you now doing an establishment of a religion? Aren't you violating the First Amendment by providing money? That's how the challenge happens. That's the process, okay? I know it may be, for those of you who did not study this, this will be, again, a course, but that's the best I could do. Hopefully, I've given you an explanation of how it's called federalism. It's the balance of powers. It's a separation of powers. You've heard these terms before. It's the balance of power, separation of powers, and then it's called the federalism system. All right, next slide. All right. So here I'm going to go now into actual cases that I discuss in the book to give you how this operates and what the tests the courts do in order to determine what happens. On one side, I'm not sure if you're left or you're right here, you have the what was called Hakenkreuz, or the Nazi symbol, right? You may have been familiar with that. That case dealt with a Hindu couple living in Queens, New York, where they were celebrating the celebration of Diwali. It's a sort of it's a Christmas type of ceremony, a holiday for people of Hindu faith. When they posted this symbol in their lawn in the front of their home. However, they were in a very Jewish neighborhood, a heavily Jewish neighborhood. And according to the Jewish community, they saw that as a Nazi cross and wanted and told the police to have those people take that sign down because it was offensive and it was creating havoc in the community. The question then rose: can you use the police to enforce a private right of the Jewish community because they were being offended, as opposed to the right of the Hindu couples to be able to have their symbol? In that particular case, they ruled that this was a symbol that was pre-existed Nazism, and therefore they had the right to demonstrate it and show it, and the Jewish community could not exercise the right to try to stop them. Now, in the book, I go through different variations. What if this? What if this? What happens if a crowd? And because there's other ways that perhaps if the crowd started up and there was some sort of riot or danger to the community where the police could involve themselves. And so I go through nuances in the law in order to make it interesting for you to try to understand that development of that crisis. The second picture is one of a shaman that I took in Peru, and he, of course, is this praying, believes in the nature and how they pray to nature basically, and that's what he was doing in this ceremony in front of you. And so I bring up the case of Lukine Babalu Avenue versus the city of Hialeah. And in that case, had to do with persons who are practice the faith of Santeria. That comes from Africa, but heavily practiced in Cuba and Haiti. So these couple, they were Haitian descent, were in Miami, and they would use sacrifice of animals as part of their religious practice. So the most of the people in Hialeah were either a Christian faith and believed this practice to be witchcraft and believed it to be unholy and unsanitary. And so they passed regulations to prohibit the use of animals for ritual sacrifices. That was a clash. In this particular case, the court looked into the practice and said, this is a personal practice. They're killing animals, and in non-Santeria kill animals too. They just, the difference on is one, you eat the animals, and the other one is the practice that for religion. But since they could not, the court felt that since the city had not established a neutral basis for which to prohibit the slaughter of animals, they ruled the city council to be establishing a religion or prohibiting the Santeria group from practicing their religion freely. And in that case, they struck down the statute and allowed the Santeria people to follow and be able to sacrifice animals. And so that's how they resolved that case. Next slide. All right. So this particular slide points out two cases. One is the case of James Dale, who sued the Boy Scouts of America. James Dale was a counselor for the Boy Scouts, and he was gay. When the Boy Scouts organization found out that he was in fact gay, they decided that they would fire him because it was inconsistent with the purpose of the Boy Scouts, which was more a Christian oriented, although it doesn't say it's a Christian organization, they say it was Christian oriented. So now I have a situation where you have an organization who has a right to association. In this case, the Boy Scouts have the right to choose themselves. and the right of Mr. Dale to be free to exercise his own rights about his own life. So the courts in that case, as they examine and balance the rights between the Boy Scouts and James Dale, determined that the Boy Scouts had enough reason to fire him because they have a purpose in their bylaws and payroll that gives them the right to control, as far as the freedom of association, the ability to control. So that, based on the balancing of the acts, they determined that the Boy Scouts could in fact discriminate. The next case, 303 Creative LLC versus Ennis, is a case that you probably read about. This is more recent case. The Boy Scout case rose out of New Jersey. But the 303 Creative case is the case that I basically mentioned earlier, of a gay couple who tried to retain a baker in order to bake a cake for them. And the baker said, I do not want to bake this cake in surprise and in support of the gay community, because I believe that's a abhorrent behavior. It's against my religion, therefore I won't provide it. On the other side, the gay couple will say, wait a minute, what about the public accommodations law? Am I right not to be discriminated against? I should not be able to be discriminated. You have no right to discriminate against me. In that particular case, the court determined there's a difference between providing an art, a form of art, which was the baker's ability to bake a cake, as opposed to, let's say, if you went into the auto parts store and a gay couple walked in, they wanted to buy a battery, and you would say, I'm not selling you the battery because of a religious belief. One thing has nothing. The courts in that case separated that. They say, the baker is not merely selling you cookies, he is selling you his art, his ability to be creative. And because of that, that's different. Now he has the right to discriminate against you because it's beyond the public accommodations law. So that's how the court were able to divide that baby. Next slide. Okay. In this series of cases, again, in the book, I go into much more detail about the type of tests. I don't go into the type of tests that the courts use in order to make that balancing. How do I develop? They have developed different kinds of tests that they'll say, okay, if this, then this, if this, then this, if this, then this, and then they have the test, and then they determine how to balance these relative rights. So the school-led prayers is a whole series of cases that deals with the right of the public organizations like schools, city halls, etc., to be involved in particular religious organizations and religious practices. You may have seen cases, for example, in your reading that they put religious Christmas song or Christian crosses on the public city hall. That has been stricken down as being unconstitutional establishment. But if they allow everyone else to put their symbols, then the courts seem to be swinging and saying, well, it's not establishment of a religion. If you prohibit the Christians only, then that is a prohibition against the free exercise. So in that case, what we have is a series of cases that come out with prayers in school. And in this picture is a famous case here in Florida where, of course, the coach would call out the team in the middle of the floor to come out and pray. And it was a Christian prayer. The people, those non-Christians, objected to having an official of the church, official of the government, lead a prayer because those non-Christians will feel alienated and will feel discriminated against. The court ruled that a government employee, which is a teacher, is a government employee, who leads the prayer and is required to lead the prayer by some sort of internal regulation. In this case, was a regulations they had from the county. The school board passed a rule saying there would be such a prayer. So you had government regulation, you had the teacher leads them in prayer, and that was determined to be an establishment of a religion because they excluded. Now, so then what they did, they followed back up the same school, the same teacher. They instead of having the teacher, they had a student lead it, and it was a recommended. So it would only be those that wanted. It would be led by want to participate. It would be led by a student and not an official. And they found that that is okay. See that's how they found those cases. Now, in the next series of cases that I discuss in the book is about the right to die, which I think was where the future of is going to be a lot of litigation on this. As in the United States, we have a lot of seniors now. We have our demographics are that we have getting more and more seniors and less children. The demographics are moving in that direction. And we're living longer, and we're not having as many babies, and we have a lot of healthcare. I mean, in the book, I talk about the amount of money that is being spent in Medicare and Medicaid over the last several years. This is the trillions that has piled up because we're maintaining people for a longer life. But you do not have a right to die. You don't have a right to kill yourself. You don't have a right to suicide. You cannot take hemlock. Well, you can do it, but it would not be legal. And if your wife helped you or your husband helped you, take the hemlock and cook the concoction, they would eventually take your life. They would go to jail for manslaughter or homicide. So there was a series of cases. They came out with Dr. Kevorkian. You may have recalled his name or heard about his name, where Dr. Kevorkian was dedicated to the principle that people should have artificially be maintained alive if they don't want to live in the condition that they're in. And so he created a machine that had a concoction of drugs that you press the button, it would go into your veins and you would kill yourself. Well, he was arrested for that. But the court ruled that because he himself, Dr. Kevorkian, did not himself press the button, he did not cause it, therefore he was not guilty. Let him go. But Dr. Kevorkian wanted to test the system. So he created another machine where he himself, and in a different state, where he himself would push the button. And he filmed the whole thing, all right? So that there's no doubt that he was the one that did it. And so he was arrested and he was convicted. Even though there was a full statement by the person who died, I want to do this. This is my choice. I want him to help me. And Dr. Cohen then did it, challenged the law. He was arrested and he was convicted for manslaughter. There are several cases like Caroline Quinlan case, a case here in Florida called Terry Schiavo. That had to do with people who are comatose and technically alive, but in this long coma, which is not alive. In the case of Terry Schiavo, which went national, went to the United States Supreme Court, that was a case where she was in a comatose for many, many years. Her husband, who was her guardian, wanted to end the artificial maintenance of fluids that kept her alive. The parents of Terry Schiavo wanted to keep her alive because they believed that one day God would bring her back to them. So when the hospital didn't know what to do, the husband brought the case up and they went to court. The state of Florida got involved, and actually by statute, they changed the law of Florida that said that the husband is a natural guardian able to make those decisions. And that was stricken down, found to be unconstitutional what they did. And they allowed the husband to be able to unplug his wife. But it's a case that went on, and there's more details in the book. Caroline Quinlan was another case where the parents wanted to keep the person artificially, they wanted to artificially take away the artificial sustenance of life. The hospital refused to do it because Caroline Quinlan herself had not given permission. She had not written a document in that she did not want to have her life ended. And the parents had to sue in order to exercise their right to be able to terminate her life. Today, as a result of those cases, actually, today everybody goes in. They have to have a living will. Everybody is asking you, please have a living will and designated person to assign your end of life treatment because precisely because of this. So every hospital requires you had to have a designated surrogate and to have a living will, and just in case you have to end, and they're authorized to end your life. But that still that helps somewhat, but doesn't help for the person who's terminally ill, who knows they have only 8 or 9 months, maybe at most a year. You cannot artificially end your life, and you cannot have anybody else artificially end your life. So it's a little bit different of the Hemlock Society. I think this is an issue that's going to be tested a lot in the coming years, precisely because of the number of elderly that we have, and they're being alive, but they're alive, but at what cost? And at their independence, or they're alive, but they're just potted plants. So this is an issue that's going to be decided. And again, in the book, I talk about the tests the courts use in order to balance the relative interests between the parents, the husband, the wife, the government, and the individual. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so I wanted to discuss here again. See, this is a lot of traffic here, a lot of stuff that we're talking about. But I thought it would be important to discuss what many people mix up in the United States, and everyone. What about my inalienable rights? I have a right. I have inalienable rights. And they talk about this as if somewhere they have that right. And what was shocking to most Americans to realize is that this whole thing of, as we saw in our Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Almost every American can recite this, but that's not law. That's not law. That's an aspirational document. It is not the law of the land. There is no natural law in the Constitution. You do not have an express written right to privacy or right to anything. It's whatever is in this document is what you have rights to. All right. Mm-hmm. So when you created the documents, you created the executive and the legislator and the courts. That's what rights you have. That's pretty shocking for most Americans. Okay, next slide. So, right here, natural law is not to be conferred on an individual, but inherent in his human personality. All right. This is aspirational. This is spiritual. These are spiritual laws, that you have a right to free expression, that you have the right to be free. Where does it say you have a right to be free? Only if in government, in regular government, you have to have it written someplace in the document that rules the government. So if the document doesn't say that, if the document says you shall be a slave, well, then that's what it is. That's the law. And so what about my natural law? Well, I have no place to enforce that natural law. That's not part of the government. Next slide. So then question comes up, are judges politicians or theoreticians? Why is this question popping up? I'll give you a good example before I get into the current examples. Everyone knows about Brown versus Board of Education. That was the case that established that separate but equal schools and public schools is okay. That's constitutional. As long as the schools have the same amount of money being spent on them and you have the same kind of books, then you can have schools for Black children, you can have schools for white children. That's okay. That's Plessy versus Ferguson. Came around Brown versus Board of Education, and then the court decided that, wait a minute, separate can never be equal. As long as you're having separate places, separate schools, you're implying an inequality. So they decided to interpret the separate as being unequal, as opposed to maybe what the statute said, Separate and equal. Equal, well, separate schools and equal in spending. Well, excuse me. But those judges on the Brown versus Board of Education case say, wait a minute, if you have them separate, they can never be equal because you're implying an inequality. So the Brown versus Board of Education changed the precedent of Plessy versus Ferguson. And that was the question, how did you do that? Okay, that gets to the questions of how judges practice their philosophy, their thinking. We call them judges, Republicans, or Democrats. They may have been registered Republican, Democrats, but they don't make decisions based on whether they're Republicans or Democrats. They make their determinations based on their philosophy of how to interpret. So a more conservative judge will look at it and say, okay, I'm not elected to be a politician or to be a legislator or to make law. I don't make law. All I do is interpret the law that is passed. I don't decide to give it a twist that is fairer. So a conservative judge would not likely to do what they did in Brown versus Board of Education and say, oh, you know what? Separate or equal doesn't really mean separate and equal. It means they must be all together. See, that's a creation. That was a progressive bench that decided that they had to interpret the law separately. So a progressive judge will look at the law as written, look at the circumstances around the law and the circumstances of society and say, you know, things have changed since 100 years ago when we had this last decision. And I think it has to go this way, they interpret it this way. So that's why you got Brown versus Board of Education. The same thing happened with Roe versus Wade. And Roe versus Wade, a case which most of you probably know, that's the case establishing the woman's right to have an abortion. That was a right that a liberal court decided if this right to have an abortion comes out of the freedom to control, right of privacy. It comes out of the right of privacy, even though the Constitution says nothing about the right of privacy. It's implied. It comes out of the Constitution, an implied right of privacy. And therefore, if you have an implied right of privacy, you can have an abortion. A conservative court just recently said, no, wait a minute, there is no implied right. That's not in the Constitution. And therefore, we're not going to interpret this right of privacy the woman say there is the way the previous court is, and we're going to overrule that portion of Roe versus Wade, which created this implied right of privacy. All right? Now, because people don't understand how the judges came to those conclusions. Again, I pray, you do not have to agree with the decision and still respect the way the system works. I am trying to only explain how it happens. I don't necessarily agree with that position, but that doesn't mean that I could not understand why the judges rule that way. You have a judicial philosophy of how you interpret the law, and that goes all the way. And I can get, there's a whole bunch of cases recently, a Chevron case, which outside the scope of this, the court did the same thing. You have the conservative judges saying, I'm not going to expand what is the written statute or written constitution because I'm not elected to do that job. If you want something like that, go back to the legislature and ask them to write the law. That's the conservative, textualist or original, let's call originalist. Next. Okay, so we're gonna end in this with this group. This is a video done on Hollywood, but the skit is actually perfectly explains what and how these decisions are made by judges. So if you would play the clip.
Okay, I just want to say one thing about this clip. Tony has already said that it establishes what actually does happen, even though it's a Hollywood show. But where the clip begins, I want to give you guys just a little bit of backdrop. what they're doing here is this man who is being asked these questions is being considered to be the nominee to be a Supreme Court judge. So right now he's a judge, but the presidency has said, hey man, you're the right stuff and we got a seat on the bench and you're going to be our nominee for the Supreme Court. And that's what they're doing. I just wanted to establish that. So when you see this, thank you, Tony. When you see this man being kind of grilled, it's really an honor. He's been brought into the president's office, and then they're asking him about his judicial philosophy. Yes. And now Vernon's going to play the clip.
Judges are bound to interpret the Constitution within the strict parameters of the text itself. The Constitution doesn't provide for a right of privacy. The right doesn't exist.
The Third Amendment says soldiers can't be quartered in private homes. The Fifth provides protection against self-incrimination, and the Fourth against unreasonable searches. Do you deny the right to privacy lives in those passages?
No, I do not deny it. But the fact that the framers enumerated those specific protections is all the more reason to believe that they had no intention of making privacy a de facto right.
They just fought a revolution. They had no question of their freedoms. The Bill of Rights was meant to codify the most crucial of those rights, not to limit the others.
I do this for a living, Mr. Seaborn.
So do I, Your Honor.
Peyton, do I have the right to put on an ugly plaid jacket and a loud polka dot tie and walk down Main Street?
Yes.
And where in the Constitution is that right guaranteed?
First Amendment, freedom of expression.
What about the use of cream in my coffee? Surely there can be no free speech argument to be made there.
No.
So you would have no objection to the state of New Hampshire passing a law banning the use of cream in coffee?
I would have strong objection, Mr. President, as I like cream as well, but I would have no constitutional basis to strike down the law when you brought your case to the Supreme Court.
As I lose the votes of coffee drinkers everywhere.
1987, there was a sizable block of delegates who were initially opposed to the Bill of Rights. This is what a member of the Georgia delegation had to say by way of opposition. If we list a set of rights, some fools in the future are going to claim that people are entitled only to those rights enumerated and no others. So the framers knew.
Were you just calling me a fool, Mr. Seaborn?
I wasn't calling you a fool, sir. The brand new state of Georgia was.
Gentlemen, laws must emanate from the Constitution.
There are natural laws, Judge.
I do not deny there are natural laws, Mr. Ziegler. I only deny that judges are empowered to enforce them.
Then who will?
That's not up to me. And this sideshow is over. With all due respect, Mr. President, I find this kind of questioning very rude.
Well, then you're really going to enjoy meeting the U.S. Senate.
Be that as it may, it's disgusting. We all know you need me as much as I need you. I read the same polling information you do. 7 to 10 point bump, 90 votes, unanimous out of committee. I was courted. Now you have me taken to school by some kid.
That Sam is young drives me nuts too, but he took you out for a ride, sir, because that's what I told him to do.
I am an extremely well-credentialed man, Mr. President. And I am unaccustomed to this sort of questioning.
I understand, Peyton. Could you give us a little time, please? We'll make you comfortable while you're waiting.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Put him on a bus.
That's a guaranteed confirmation we're sending out the door based on a 30-year-old piece of paper, which, by the way, no one will ever know about but us.
You don't think the guy that called Sam would know how to call a senator's office?
Mr. President, if this is really about abortion, he already told us...
It's not just about abortion. It's about the next 20 years. 20s and 30s, it was the role of government. 50s and 60s, it was civil rights. The next 2 decades are going to be privacy. I'm talking about the internet. I'm talking about cell phones. I'm talking about health records and who's gay and who's not. And moreover, in a country born on the will to be free, what could be more fundamental than this? Toby.
Let's meet Mendoza.
All right. right, so that clip perfectly examples what we've been talking about, what my point of my book is about. Try to understand what they, in that particular case, how the judge interpreted the Constitution. His philosophy is going to tell you how he's going to rule on Roe versus Wade, as opposed to the way Seaborn was talking. He's going to have a more liberal and expansive of understanding of the rights that emanate from the Constitution. If we understand that, we will more appreciate our government. We'll more appreciate the judges. We don't have to hate them. We don't have to, call them names. And if the judges are true to their philosophies, then we can respect them. If they don't, if not true, one day they're strict constructionists, and the next decision also they're progressive, then you've got to decide that whether they're politicians or whether they are in fact theoreticians. And with that, I'll conclude, and I'll take any questions.